The first time I walked the low ring roads around Caen, I carried an old map whose edges had gone to felt from 100 fingers. On paper, the villages looked harmless beads on a string: Buren, Othi, Carpiquet, Eterville, Malto, Cagny, Bras. In stone and hedgerow, they became a maze with teeth. Church towers stand back from the lanes like watchmen. Walled gardens pinch the streets into alleys. Orchards bake in their own green heat. Here, in June and July of 1944, tanks learned that Normandy does not forgive impatience. The countryside promised room to move. The villages revoked the promise at every corner. I read the diaries in the evening and walked the lanes by morning. And in both, a single argument kept repeating itself: a Sherman hunting angles against a Panther that preferred the first shot from the shade. Caen was supposed to fall on D-Day, or close to it, a tidy objective attached to a neat plan. The plan meant men from 12th SS Hitlerjugend, Panzerlehr, and 21st Panzer who thought neatness was a civilian luxury. The British and Canadians kept leaning. The city kept its stubborn geometry. To the west around Tilly-sur-Seulles, to the northwest near Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse and Noray-en-Bessin, to the south along Hill 112's long back. The fight became a slow carpentry of fire and stone. We tell it now in the shorthand of Operations Epsom: Charnwood, Goodwood, totalized, but on the ground the chapters were written in orchard walls and sightlines measured by breath. I learned to see the battle not as arrows, but as a string of rooms, each with its own trapdoor. Sherman versus Panther is a technical debate until the road narrows to a lane and the hedges lean in. On paper, the verdict is easy. The Panther's long 75 can write death at ranges, where the Sherman's common 75mm struggles to edit back. The Glacis laughs at glancing blows. The gunner's world through that TZF sight is a clean, steady rectangle. But the maze cares little for paper. In villages, the first shot is often the only one that counts. And the first shot belongs to whoever understands how a shadow turns into a keyhole. British troops learned to make a Firefly their conscience 17-pounder in a squadron otherwise armed for smoke and speed, and to let that long barrel nose into viewpoints while the 75s did the work of smoke, suppression, and courage. German crews learned that a Panther's gift becomes a liability when it must slewing turn in a courtyard, while a churchyard wall hides a plain Sherman with a gun that is ordinary until it meets a side plate at 30 yards. Operation Epsom set the tone. Rain, swollen rivers. Bridges argued over with a kind of spite. In the villages like stubborn stepping stones. I hold a photocopy of a squadron log from late June. Entered Shoe at 5:40 heavy MG and AT fire. 2 Panthers sighted across the main street beyond the square. Firefly engaged. Smoke laid. Moved right through gardens. I walked that street with the log in my pocket. Counted the paces from the corner to the battered doorway where the Firefly would have halted. And the angle resolved itself. The Panther's head turned to face the larger avenue. The Firefly's view, a thin slice between 2 gateposts. The numbers in the log are modest range. 200 yards, number of rounds fired. 4 hits, 2, and yet in those modest numbers, a square is won for an hour. And an hour becomes the plank on which the next company crosses to the next square. Near Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse, the village that sits like a thumb on the rail line. A troop of Shermans pushed in at dusk. The hedges there grow so close they feel intentional, like an ambush planted by a gardener who knew tanks were coming. A Panther lurked at the far end of the main street, engine idling low, exhaust whispering into brick. The loader's hand in the Sherman remembered its own routine even as the commander's voice went thin in his throat. The first round struck the corner of a wall and showered carnations and stone. The second walked in by memory and scraped the Panther's mantlet, a cruel kiss that did not save anyone. The third from the Firefly, fired from the side lane no one sees until they do, was the one that wrote the final sentence. The Panther's hatch curled like a lip. Men ran, men didn't. The troop leader's after-action line is the purest sentence I know from that day. We had the angle before they had the distance. That is how the maze answers theory. Carpiquet Airfield drew blood because runways pretend to be planes, but are actually stages for rehearsed fire. South of it, The Canadian advance brushed the outskirts of Buren and Authie, where every garden became a redoubt. The Panthers of 12th SS played chess with poor sportsmanship, hit and back, relocate behind a barn, use the church tower a moment before the war taught you not to. In a Canadian report I marked with a paperclip, a tank commander writes, Panther at 400 behind cafe. Took the first. We smoked the lane. Firefly killed it with one across the face when it moved. There's no romance in it to those men. Only the stern pleasure of technique vindicated. But in the dust afterward, when I kneel by the curb where that cafe once stood and place my palm on stone that has forgotten heat, the fight refuses to stay polite. It exhales burned paint, wet limestone, old cordite that is not there anymore, and still is. Hill 112 haunted everyone who walked its low, long spine. Tanks do not like hills that are actually tables set for gunners. Panthers sat back from the crest in hull down, content to own the approaches at ranges you can count in fractions of a mile. Shermans pushed up under smoke and learned the discipline of unprofiled movement. A British troop leader described the sound of the long 75 as 2 beats first, the clap of the shot, then the sigh that comes with the bolt sliding on the next man's life. He wrote that and then crossed it out. I can see why. Some sentences are true and unfair at the same time. On that hill, the right flank of a troop could disappear, as if a dark sleeve had been tugged into shadow. On the left, a Firefly would inherit an entire fight and carry it with a restraint that looks like sorcery in the retelling, and is only practice carried to its limit. Villers-Bocage sits west of this story, but sends a rumor into every room lesson learned in one street about what a single heavy tank can do if you let it enter a town unannounced. The British had that rumor in their ears whenever a village's first right-hand corner went blind. No one wanted to be the next line in a cautionary tale, so the Shermans probed with infantry fingers. Panther gunners guarded alleys like jealous men, and the lanes filled with the small noises that keep armies alive, track pins checked with a hammer, a corporal whispering a distance to the man on the ranging drum, a driver feeling the difference between cobble and earth through a lever like a stethoscope. In the late afternoons, the bells sometimes rang because villages have habits, and the ringing placed a heartbeat under the machinery. The men remembered they had their own. Operation Charnwood broke into North Caen under a sky black with the soot of bombers. Panthers did their killing in the streets to the south. Shermans found they could be brave if smoke made the world 10 yards long. We tell a story of Panthers and Shermans as if it were a duel, and sometimes it was. More often, it was a conspiracy of trades infantry opening a door in a wall, gunners pinning a lane, sappers silencing a rumor of mines, and then the tanks moving into the favor of all those small acts. A Sherman crew that knows it is loved by its friends will do unreasonable things and survive them. A Panther crew that discovers the next corner holds not fear, but a Firefly learns that confidence is a flower some climates do not support. I have stood on the Bourgaboose Ridge where Goodwood would throw metal like a curtain, and from that slope, the villages of the Caen Plain look like game pieces. They are not. Each is a mind, and inside each mind a dark and a light. Panther and Sherman brought their own darkness and their own light to these rooms. Before the heavy east of Caen surge, there was this west and south grind, this education in how stone corners decide whether a legend writes itself or is erased by a well-placed shot at a bad angle. When I close the diary for June and open July, the noise rises. The fields turn from green to a tired gold, the color of old brass. Engines learn a new pitch. The maze does not get kinder, only better mapped. July began to speak in a harsher register, and the city finally let go of its northern hem. The files call it Progress Charnwood on one cover sheet, Atlantic on another, but in the lanes the word was abrasion. North Caen broke open under smoke and blast, and the orange bridges shivered under traffic that would have cracked a lesser plan. South of the river, the same names kept returning like stubborn footnotes. Ifs, Cormel, Fleury, Solier, Bras, Hubert-Folie, Bourgabouse, Cagny. I carried aerial prints marked with grease pencil arrows toward those villages, and I walked the ground after rain until the smell of crushed nettles turned every page into a memory. The maze did not end at the river. It multiplied, where hedgerows had made narrow rooms, Ruined suburbs added corridors of brick and metal, new angles for Panthers, new blind corners for Shermans, new places for a Firefly to turn a courtyard into a verdict. Every troop I spoke with later remembered the same contradiction: the city burned behind them and yet made light, the country ahead of them wide and yet made small. Beyond the Orne lay the eastern arc that would stage Goodwood, and before Goodwood lay a week of sharpening. Shermans learned again how to breathe inside rubble. Panthers learned that even the best sight is only as good as the corner it can see past. In Columbells, by the chimneys of the steelworks, smoke did as much killing as guns. A battalion log notes: Firefly engaged target across rail cutting. First shot obscured by dust, second fired on memory. I stood by that cutting and felt the hum of old trains under the weeds, and tried to imagine the courage that trusts a correction you cannot see. The maze here spoke railway as well as hedgerow. The preface to Goodwood is always written in tonnage. The bombers came at dawn on the 18th waves, and waves that made the horizon a corrugated sheet of slow fire. Villages were hammered into different shapes. Fields grew new patterns of craters. A railway embankment east of Caen held a shock like a tuning fork. The theory behind the thunder was simple: blind the Panthers, paralyze the guns, let 3 armored divisions pour through the bridgehead like water through a sluice. The practice, as always, preferred nuance. Dust climbed into a man-made weather and threw a veil across an advance that depended on sight. Some anti-tank crews lived through the storm under concrete and steel, blinking ash from their eyes and laying their sights back onto a world newly covered in powdered stone. I read 11th Armored's march table lanes assigned by minute through the 6th Airborne bridgehead, intervals exact as a drum line, and then I read the day's reality tanks bunched by traffic, delayed by smashed vehicles at the crossings, corrected by military police with faces like metronomes. When at last they shook into the open east of Caen, the ground offered its cruel invitation: long, hard fields edged by a rail embankment and dotted with villages whose names would stick to memory with different kinds of glue. Bras and Hubert Folia, the soft consonants of orchards and gardens. Cagny and Emiaville, the hard syllables of guns. Bourg-et-Bousse, the ridge that looked modest and acted like a schoolmaster. Sherman versus Panther on that plain became a debate of seconds. Shermans moved in church parade ranks, then broke into waves, then into smaller packets when the first sheets of fire stitched their intervals. The opening shots of German 88s came not from storybook flak towers, but from guns bedded down along the embankment and field edges. Their crews disciplined enough to let the nearest prey pass and kill the second rank for effect. The Panthers who survived the bombardment waited back from the rail line or nosed in among orchards, using gaps in the smoke like keyholes. British commanders kept the Fireflies close and forward, long barrels peeking over ditches and trackside cuttings, looking for that fatal moment when a Panther showed one cheek too long. Canny's guns chewed time. I have an observation officer's account that tries to remain dispassionate and fails in the margins. Left flank engaged by heavy AT fire from vicinity of Canny. Request smoke, request counter battery, request the day to go backward. He crossed out the last line and added grid references. The railway embankment, blasted and scarred, still granted silhouettes to defenders who knew how to keep their nerve. Shermans cresting a culvert found themselves framed and counted. A Firefly firing from the shadow of the rail line hit a Panther so square, the hatch sprang like a hinge with a mind of its own. Seconds later, the Firefly's commander was down. A reminder that in these open rooms, the first good deed is rarely the last word. Beyond Bras and Hubert Folie, the ground tips almost politely toward Bourg-et-Bousse. That tilt is enough to make a hull disappear into earth if you place it right, and the German gunners did. British crews wrote hull down in their notebooks as a prayer. German crews read the same words as a guarantee. An 11th Armored Squadron leader sent 2 troops left to nibble the ridgeline, while a 3rd went wide to worry a flank near Frenouville. Only one came back on its own tracks. In his after action, he noted, without embroidery, Panthers remained unpersuaded. Fireflies carried the conversation. Artillery helped when asked with exact addresses. Between those plain clauses lies the day's severity. The Tigers of 503rd Heavy Battalion have their own fan club in later retellings. They appear in British reports like punctuation-annoying commas that slow sentences and murderous periods that end them. Near Soliers, a tiger shrugged off 2 quick shots and answered with a round that crushed a Sherman as if folding paper. Then a firefly, working a lateral ditch like a fox through a hedgerow, placed its effort into that tall side plate at 200 yards and taught the whole field the oldest lesson in armored war thickness matters less than angle and distance when craft finds a margin. No one cheered, engines revved, smoke layered the lane. Another minute moved through men like a long, blunt needle. Goodwood has been called a failure and a near success and everything in between. When I sift the day's papers, I hear a verdict that refuses romance. The British made ground more than any other day in Normandy, under armor alone, and they made gaps a corps could breathe through if infantry and guns were allowed to inherit. They also paid for every 100 yards with machines and crews a quartermaster cannot conjure like a magician. Panthers and 88s, when not blinded or buried, wrote messages onto turrets that no one could misread. The maze had changed scale, but not nature. Villages remained rooms with ambush in the wainscot. The railway embankment remained a wall you could not lecture into gentleness. In the orchard lanes north of Bourg-à-Bouche, I found a story told by a corporal whose job was smoke. He laid canisters like stepping stones while Shermans took turns darting from one gray island to the next. A Panther on the far side of a pear wall kept sowing the fog with rounds that made no sound until they struck. "We moved because he wanted us to stop," the corporal said later. "And we stopped because he wanted us to move." He smiled when he said it, not because it was funny, but because it was accurate. In that accuracy, there is a kind of bravery the camera never learns to love. By evening, the long armored divisions had lost their straight spine. They curled around villages won, and villages that refused to admit their names had changed hands. The Orne bridgehead behind them still funneled life. The ridge in front of them still required a theology of patience. A troop found shelter under the brow of a chalk pit and learned that you can hold a world if you keep your engine quiet and your heart quieter. Another troop, too far forward without infantry, was pinched and taught that the maze punishes any unit that tries to own a room alone. War is a manager of humility. Normandy is its most exacting clerk. I stood at dusk on the flattened crown of that embankment and watched the light go silver on shards of slate. The air smelled, inexplicably, of apples and hot iron. East of me, the land leaned to the south like a shoulder. West, the city glowed as if it were its own moon. The day had given the British a corridor of ground and taken back a weight of crews they could not replace quickly. The Panthers had been neither invincible nor a myth. They had been what good crews make of good machines, a problem that can ruin you if you argue in the wrong language. The Shermans had been what they always were in the right hands, not champions in a duel, but teammates in a conspiracy of arms, smoke, speed, angle, a long 17-pounder in the right place at the right second, infantry near enough to hear and be heard. That night, map tables were redrawn with fingers instead of pencils because men were too tired to trust their hands. Orders for the morning spoke without pretense: hold the new line. Prise open Caen and Emeuville. Keep the guards armored, ready to lean if a hinge creaks. I closed the folder and felt the old itch in my feet to walk the road again at first light, to find the corners where a panther might wait and the doorways where a firefly had once breathed out and made the lane honest. The maze had not ended. It had learned new rooms. The next day would make men choose again between distance and angle, speed and shadow, faith and tape. It always does here. Morning came on with a dull metallic taste, the kind that tells you the day will be a book of errands written in steel. We held the line fanned out below Bourg-à-Bouche and along the rail, and the city smoked behind us as if jealous of all the attention the South was getting. What the papers call consolidation felt like a recital we could not skip. Bury the dead, tow the wrecks, square the map with what the ground would actually allow, and send patrols to discover which villages had been won in the night and which had only agreed to a truce. Panthers that had lived through Goodwood's furnace were suddenly shy, but shyness is a tactic in Normandy. They sat back on slopes and watched. The Shermans learned again the discipline of being seen only on purpose. The fireflies were counted like instruments after a rough concert barrel's cleaned, sights re-zeroed, Crews briefed with a new humility that comes from surviving a lesson. South of us, the ridge that looks unassuming in photographs, Verrières began to insist on its proper name. A ridge in Normandy is not a mountain, it is a ledger. Whoever holds the brow writes the day's arithmetic. In late July, operations with pretty names Atlantic, Spring asked Canadian brigades to climb that ledger line under weather that could not decide between rain and hot breath. I paced the forward slopes where the Black Watch and others went up and down and did not always come back. And the ground was as honest today as it was then, fields that offer a promise and then deny it with a 300-yard stretch of exposure. An orchard that pretends to be shelter and turns into a trap the instant a long 75 finds the right range. Panther hulls waited 2 fields back, presenting only turrets like thoughtful animals. The Shermans worked smoke like a second language and crawled, not because they lacked courage, but because the ridge rewards the slow sentence over the shout. The after-action lines from those days are stripped of decoration. Enemy AT effective, Firefly engaged, infantry pinned, counterattack pressed by Panthers from Saint, Martin de Fontenay, artillery helpful when exact. I stood by the sunken lane north of Tilly-la-Campagne and counted the paces a troop would have needed to reach the next hedge, with its flanks still in the same story. 35 paces of honesty, then 10 of gambling, then the corner where a Firefly might dictate truth for a minute if it lived through the first reply. Panther's superiority on paper felt absolute here. In practice, it was only ever conditioned by angle, by patience, by a sergeant who knew when a culvert gives you just enough hull down to take a breath you can spend. Rain did us a favor and a cruelty. It flattened dust that had been betraying us. It turned fields to a grip that betrayed us differently. Tracks slurred, engines fought for air. Crews learned to judge not just hedges and walls, but the way a boot sank at the gate. Meanwhile, the city's southern skirts, Ifs and Cormel, Saint André-sur-Orne and May-sur-Orne became the backstage from which new acts would walk on. We were lighting candles for a larger push that had a different music night columns, searchlights for artificial moon, heavy bombers again, and infantry inside armored carriers that would rewrite the first paragraph of every attack plan they entered. By August, the voice on the page changed meters. Simon's plan wore a name that sounded like impatience, but underneath was all about procedure. Total eyes would go at night across the same chessboard that had cost brigades their skin by day columns in paired lanes. White tape and compass more sacred than any trumpet. Bombers punching holes ahead the size of parishes, and the oddest new animal in the menagerie, the kangaroo. Priests without guns, reborn as armored buses to carry infantry through the blast radius alive. I have the mimeographed orders, route letters, phase lines, timings in minutes. Sherman troops paired deliberately with Fireflies at the head of packets. Typhoons marked as callers on the morning after to swat whatever guns survived the night's sermon. The night totalize began. I walked the assembly areas with a veteran's letter folded in my pocket. It felt like a factory shift, he wrote, not a crusade. Engines idled low. Searchlights turned the underside of clouds into a pale ceiling. Sappers stood with their rods like ushers. When the bombers arrived, the earth made the sound that turns men into arithmetic if discipline fails. Discipline did not fail everywhere. Columns stepped off behind the noise and slid into the garden south of Caen with an ordinary grace that has no poster. The next morning's notebooks read like proof infantry dismounted where they were supposed to. Fireflies found ambush places pre-scouted. Shermans took crossroads by paperwork and then by shell. Of course, the sky is not a tame ally. Short bombs fell where friends were supposed to be. Lanes kinked under craters the plan had not ordered. But the novelty, the kangaroos, the tight columns, the insistence on artificial moon shortened the time between first contact, and the moment tanks could be where Panthers did not want them. South of Ciento, near Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil and Gomenil. The day lifted its mask for an instant and showed a familiar, savage face, heavy German armor counterattacking to pinch the new corridor. Tigers came, everyone remembers that, and with them Panthers and Grenadiers, intent on proving that night and novelty had not altered the grammar. What followed has been argued at kitchen tables and in club rooms for decades. Who killed whom? At what range? From what ditch? I have read the German and Canadian lines until they blur, and I have stood by the orchard wall where a tiger's career ended in a composition of angles that would please a geometry teacher and break a mother's heart. Panthers moved in packs, finding flanks the way wolves test for gaps. Shermans and fireflies answered in pairs, one laying smoke like sentences between bullets, the other waiting for that sliver of side that is the only democracy steel recognizes. In a troop leader's book from that day, the shorthand is brutal. 2 panthers, one across road, one in orchard, smoke on road, wait 5, on. Second reversed, firefly took cheek at 300. Lost corporal, moved. There is no music in those lines except the kind that keeps men alive. By the second dawn of Total Eyes, the map had shortened in a way that had been theory for weeks and was suddenly fact. Tilly-la-Campagne was behind our collars. Gumenil, for all its smallness, was a lever we now owned. The road to Falaise was a sentence people could say without sounding like optimists. Tanks felt it bodily. Instead of living permanently under hedges, they could breathe in fields and use speed without being called fools. Panthers felt it, too. They were still lethal. It takes a special kind of historian to forget that, but their favorite rooms were shrinking. A Sherman with a firefly near and infantry inside kangaroos could choose its engagements with a confidence that had been scarce in July. When Panthers showed, they were more often arriving to punish the end of a paragraph than to dictate a new chapter. The cost ledger did not flinch. A column nudged too close to a village enfilade during a lull and was reminded that Normandy treats inattention as treason. A battery we thought buried spoke again at noon and laid 3 Shermans along a ditch like a lesson. An airstrike called on a crossroads found a column that had not been told to crouch. I record these not to spoil anyone's appetite for victory, but because victory earned in this country has a very strict palate. It does not digest lies. Tractable followed total lies like a second breath. Smoke still in the mouth. More bombers, more kangaroos, more columns feeling their way toward a pocket that had not yet learned its name. The ground south of us, toward Falaise, changed its grain. Fields lengthened, hedges lost height, villages stepped farther apart like tired men. In those longer rooms, a panther could be majestic again on its terms, until typhoons found its breathline and fireflies rested their long barrels on the lip of a ditch and turned admiration into range tables. Shermans, freed from claustrophobia, learned to live as part of a moving wall, some to blind, some to kill, some simply to be present so that friends could take the morally useful risk. I went back to Verrières Ridge after the line moved and watched clouds stack over chalk. The ridge looked smaller in August because the war had found a different scale, but it kept its authority. It taught us how to climb by procedure. It taught Panthers that invulnerability has blind corners. It taught Shermans that bravery without a firefly is a sermon without a text. Standing there, I could hear the older days whispering through the newer ones. The first hallway where a Panther had owned a street at 400 yards. The first courtyard where a firefly had bought a town square with one well-placed truth. The first orchard where a Sherman had remembered to be a teammate rather than a duelist and had therefore lived. When the corridor to Falaise began to close, the papers regained their appetite for adjectives. The men did not. A Canadian sergeant with chalk under his nails from riding a kangaroo door wrote in his pocketbook, "We are carpenters still." He meant that every mile had been planned and jointed, not snatched. He meant that a panther is a splinter that can ruin an edge if you sand the wrong way. He meant that Shermans are not hammers or saws, but parts of a bench where many tools lie ready. And only the right combination makes a chair stand under weight. If I sound like I prefer craft to legend, it is because the maze around Caen taught me how legend starves men while craft feeds them. Toward evening, the searchlights went off and real moon came on. Engines cooled with animal size. In a farmhouse yard half swallowed by nettles, a firefly crew brewed tea on a burner that had seen more action than any one of them. A panther burned out in a field, with the silent dignity that wrecks assume when the shouting is over. The road signs pointed south with the casual authority of wood made to tell the truth. We were going that way. The maze had not ended, but it had grown wide enough that tanks could be themselves more often than they had been allowed in June. That is not romance. That is victory's quiet handwriting. By mid-August, the map began to behave like a living thing, its lines tightening around a wound that had finally decided to close. Reports from patrols read like tides, changing direction. German columns pointed west at dawn, south by noon, east by dark. The compass, a confession of panic. In the pocket's throat, Trun, Chambois, Saint-Lambert. Moissy roads braided, then knotted, then tore. Tanks, which back in June had moved as soloists through the hedged rooms of Caen's maze, now learned to play as a section in a thrashing orchestra, Shermans to blind and bully, Fireflies to reach and dictate, Kangaroos to bring the infantry directly to the sentence that mattered. Panthers still bit, no professional forgets that, but the rooms in which they were sovereign shrank to courtyards of desperation. And desperation does poor gunnery. The first time I stood on Mont Ormel Hill 262, the wind wrote the shape of the pocket onto my face. The Dives Valley ran like a bruise beneath. The roads were a palimpsest of flight and pursuit. In the papers, the names settle into a litany. The Polish First Armored clawing onto the crest. Canadians pushing from Saint-Lambert and Chambois. British brigades further west, shouldering the hinge. Panthers and assault guns streamed east, west, and sideways. Armored animals convinced the hedge ahead would be kinder than the one behind. A Polish captain wrote in a notebook that now sits in a museum case. We sit on the throat. We must not cough. His tanks, Sherman mostly, with their familiar faces, were not invulnerable. They were present, and presence in that hour had the weight of doctrine. Down in Saint-Lambert, a Canadian major made the village into a diagram you can still learn from. The bridge choked. The main street became a place where vehicles decided whether they were still machines or simply wait to be abandoned. The orchard walls became calculus. Shermans took corners like tradesmen who finally owned the shop, one watching the alley, one watching the road. One with a firefly snouted just far enough to see, not enough to be seen by the next hedgerow's ghost. Panthers came in singles and pairs, noses white with road dust and fear, long 75s still writing danger at ranges that matter. But speed and angle had changed loyalties. At 200 meters and under smoke, a Sherman's ordinariness turned sovereign. At 50, even a side plate that had laughed at June now listened to August. I carry a page from the Polish regimental log written on the crest itself, where shells stitched the slope and the whole valley rang like a tight drum. Panthers on the road, it notes, firing toward our left, fireflies to counter, artillery requested, air cannot come because our smoke confuses even us. In between the clipped phrases, the day's music thunders. A firefly takes a cheek shot on a panther climbing too confidently. A second panther, reversing, snatches second gear too late and shows a wide door to a gunner who has practiced for this minute for months. The Sherman's crews, no longer forced to duel alone in gardens, became parts of a web infantry with Piats at the hedges where tracks must turn, machine gun teams to shear rushes into caution, mortars to lay slow curtains, and gunners on the heights reading the pocket like a patient whose pulse could be counted per kilometer. Chambois, that crossroads that once felt like an obscure test answer, became a word with temperature. The Canadian-American handshake there, neat in later photographs, was years in the making and days in the bleeding. The road east of town turned into a rolling anatomy lesson engine decks, lifted by blast. Glacis scratched by shrapnel, turrets cocked at impolite angles. Every record paragraph about hurry or patience. Panthers that had been built to stride found themselves backing through gaps between carts and burned half tracks. Their gun arcs choked to nothing by the accidents of retreat. A Canadian troop leader wrote in his book, "Worked by inches, killed by inches, saved by inches." That is not poetry, it is Normandy's arithmetic. The Typhoons did not own the sky every hour weather and smoke negotiated yet when they did arrive. They were a stern elder brother, Even when rockets missed, the act of aiming rewrote nerves. A Panther crew who must button up and flinch will sight slower. A fire plan adjusted to a column on a road will make the men in that column think in seconds instead of sights. Tanks love a partner who takes the edge off the other fellow's courage. On Hill 262, pilots dipped their wings at the poles when they could not shoot and made the kind of promise every soldier understands. We see you, on the ground. A firefly barrel twitched to claim another silhouette. Between those two gestures lay the language of combined arms, spoken at last without accent. I refused to lie about the cost. The ridge held because men made of habit and fear and training decided that habit and training would rule fear for the next minute and the next. Shermans burned, Panthers burned, a kangaroo, hit on the move, became a bad memory no one wanted to narrate. A Polish tank brewed up close to the crest and cooked its ammunition one stiff cough at a time. The crew came out black and blinking like miners, then went to help reload another machine, because that is how the ledger insists we balance it. In the village below, a major counted prisoners with the hands of a man who could still feel the weight of a steen and the geometry of an alley. It smelled of apples and blood, he wrote, and anyone who tells you that is not a proper sentence has never followed a map through a war. By the 20th, the pocket could still bite, but not breathe. German reports, once arrogant even in retreat, began to sound like dispatches from a flood. Fuel was wherever the enemy said it was not. Bridges were objects that used to exist. Panthers were machines whose powers shrank to the width of the next gap, the height of the next bank. A Sherman troop took a ridge above Moissy and found itself guardian of a small kingdom, a lane where two carts had wedged nose to nose, a bend where an 88 had once instructed the world and now lay silent, a ditch where four grenadiers had folded like letters no one would read. The commander wrote home years later that the day's fiercest act was not the shot he took at a Panther with his Firefly, but the moment he waved through a column of stumbling men who had ceased to be enemies because there was nothing left in them that could be called a soldier. And yet, even at the end, the duel that had haunted June reappeared for one last, clean page. A Panther, elegant even under the dust of catastrophe, came out from behind a barn at the edge of Kudahard and stood in profile as if for a book plate. The Firefly that had been waiting in the shadow of a hedge, barrel on a low arc to avoid advertising its intent, exhaled. The round struck behind the road wheel and went on to wherever rounds go when physics has decided. The Panther stuttered and leaned on air. The Firefly commander lowered his head, not in triumph, but as if someone had finally answered a question correctly and the class might go home. They did not go home. They turned hulls and looked for the next question. When at last the pocket pinched shut, the documents lost their adjectives and turned strictly to nouns: prisoners, vehicles, guns, miles. Caen behind us began to lift its head from the rubble. The orchards south of the city exhaled their bruised summer. The railway embankment where Goodwood had broken its teeth grew modest again in the evening light. In my notebook, I tried to write a sentence that would be fair to both machines. The Panther had been a better duelist at the ranges the maze rarely allowed. The Sherman had been a better citizen. A Firefly made the duel honest. Smoke and infantry made citizenship more than a metaphor. In villages, corners are constitutions. The nation that respects them lives to pass another law. I walked one last time along a lane near Syntho, where chalk dust still clung to the roots of hedges decades later. A child on a bicycle raced me and won. A church bell tried out a few notes as if testing its own courage. I placed my palm against a garden wall and felt warmth the sun had earned. Not a fire. The men whose names fill my folders did not bring peace. They carved a corridor in which peace could be set down and not fall through. If you ask me, in the cool of an archive room or at the hot edge of a field, what Sherman versus Panther means in this country of corners, I will tell you it means that craft rules fear when you train it too. That friendship between arms beats any single champion. That angles, not slogans, decide whether a crew goes home. I will tell you it smells of apples and oil, and that the maze is not an enemy when you have a map and a hand on your shoulder. The pocket closed, the ridge held. The road turned south and then east toward a river with a more famous bridge. The tanks, having learned how to be themselves in rooms that tried to unmake them, rolled on behind them. Caen began the slow miracle of remembering its own face. In the evenings, the bells were not tactical. They were simply bells, and no one ducked. That is the only victory an historian trusts when a sound returns to being only itself. Normandy taught it that hard way, with hedges and panthers, and fireflies and Shermans, and men who learned, under pressure, to be carpenters of fate.